Yeah. So today we're going to be learning a ton of advanced expressions with a short story about a man who is a really important figure in the civil rights movement in the United States. This was the movement for basically all people to be considered as equals. So people of different races, men and women, people from different religions, and so on. And also just a model global citizen, Malcolm X. So he had a really amazing use of words. So I wanted us to start out listening to a clip of him so that you can actually hear him speaking. And then in the next part, we're going to actually jump into the short story. So let me tell you how it's going to work. So I've split it into two parts, and for each part, I'm going to read it for you. And then I'll try to help you to understand all the most advanced expressions before moving on to the next part. And then at the end, you're going to test your comprehension by listening to me read it a final time, and you're not going to have any subtitles to help you out. You'll see that by the end, you're able to understand the story so much better. And quickly, before we get started, I want to give you a pro tip. Watch this lesson on the Real Life English app. Let me give you 4 reasons, 4 things that you get on the app that you won't get here on YouTube or on the podcast platform where you're listening to this. So first of all, you get vocabulary flashcards, which help you to never forget all the advanced expressions we're going to learn today, like take someone under your wing, go off the grid, take up the torch, and so many more. Second of all, you get an interactive transcript, which you can follow along with, and also you can get the definition for any other words you didn't understand that I didn't define. Third, you get the full-length lesson. So what you're seeing is actually just a preview. So if you want the rest of it, then you're gonna have to watch it on the Real Life English app. And finally, you have the opportunity to practice your speaking. We have something called the Global Speak, which you can use to speak English anytime, anywhere by simply pressing a button. This connects you to people from all around the world, so it's really great for getting to discover different cultures. So now let's jump into episode 452 of the Real Life English podcast.
And by the colonial powers of Europe having complete control over Africa, they projected the image of Africa negatively. They projected Africa always in a negative light. Jungles, savages, cannibals, nothing civilized. And naturally, it was so negative until it was negative to you and me. And you and I began to hate it. We didn't want anybody to tell us anything about Africa, and much less call us an African. And in hating Africa and hating the African, we ended up even hating ourselves without even realizing it. Because you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree. You can't hate your origin and not end up hating yourself. You can't hate Africa and not hate yourself. And you show me one of these people over here who have been thoroughly brainwashed, who has a negative attitude toward Africa, and I'll show you one that has a negative attitude toward himself. And we have been a people who hated our African characteristics. We hated our hair. We hated the shape of our nose. We wanted one of those long, dog-like noses, you know. Yeah. We hated the color of our skin. Hated the blood of Africa that was in our veins. And in hating our features and our skin and our blood, why we had to end up hating ourselves.
He's just such an amazing orator, or an amazing speaker. And for those of you that are watching on the app, of course, you have vocabulary flashcards for all the advanced expressions that he used there. There was a lot of them, but I wanted us to focus on 3 of them that I'm going to define for you here. So first of all, he talks about how Africa was projected in a negative light. So we'll use this expression with light, like a positive light, projected in a positive light, in a negative light, just meaning that it was given a positive or a negative depiction. So by projecting or painting Africa in a negative light, basically what the American government was doing, or what the media was doing, was making people think that everything that came from Africa was bad, was savage, like he said, which is, wild, not civilized, or that there's cannibals there, there's people that eat other people. So this is a very nice expression you can use as like to project or paint something in a certain light. And then there's this really nice metaphor that he used there, right? That you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree. And maybe you already understand this. If you don't know the word roots, you probably won't get it. Roots are the part of a plant that go down into the soil that absorb water and nutrients, right? And we use roots a lot figuratively. Like there's an expression to put down roots. Like if you settle in a place, you buy a house, you get a job there, right? You make a life there. Roots can also be like in your family, like the people who have come before you. So like when you talk about your roots, you talk about where you came from. So for example, for myself, one part of my family, I have Italian and Lebanese roots, meaning that my grandparents, my great-grandparents came from those places. And this is how he's using it here in this metaphor. So the roots of a tree, so basically like for African Americans, for Black people in the United States, their roots came from Africa, right? And so he says you can't hate your roots without hating the tree being the people who are currently living. And that this kind of like, as we'll see in the story that we're going to look at in a little bit, this was something that Malcolm X tried to promote a lot, was that he found that a lot of African Americans like hated themselves because of the image that they were given from like the media, from the culture, from the white people and everything. And he tried to sort of help people to connect to them being worthy, for them being valuable, for them loving themselves, basically. Finally, the final term I wanted to cover with you is brainwashed. So you can actually think of taking your brain and washing it, right? If someone were to actually take your brain and wash it, we use this expression to say that someone has kind of inculcated you, or they've forced certain ideas into your brain. So using it here, it's kind of like very similar to what I've been talking about, is that white people and the media and the government and so on back in the day in the States had this way of brainwashing people, both white and Black people, to believe that there was superiority and inferiority of different races. All right, so let's jump right into the story with Malcolm X. You're going to get to know him a lot better because this covers his entire life. And we've broken it up into 2 parts, all right? So I'm going to read, and you can follow along with the transcript in the app or with subtitles and try to understand. And then we're going to cover all of the most important expressions. So let's take a look at that first part. 4-year-old Malcolm Little's earliest memory was of white supremacists burning down his house. It was 1929. The Ku Klux Klan has recently broken the windows of his parents' home in Lansing, Michigan, threatening worse if the family didn't move out of the neighborhood. Not long after, Malcolm's father was run over by a streetcar. The police ruled his death an accident. The locals said a KKK member pushed him. Malcolm's mom couldn't afford to feed all 7 children now that dad was gone. She cracked. By the time Malcolm was a teenager, she was living in a mental hospital. He told his school teachers that he wanted to be a lawyer, but racism stood in the way. "You've got to be realistic about being an NIGGER," his English teacher told him. "A lawyer? That's no realistic goal. Why don't you plan on carpentry?" Angry, Malcolm dropped out of school. He started smoking drugs, then selling drugs, then stealing to pay for drugs. At age 19, he got caught trying to fence a watch. By the time his white girlfriend sold him out from the witness box and the judge gave him the maximum sentence because you had no business with white girls, Malcolm decided that he hated white people. He had 6 to 8 years to let that hate fester from inside a federal prison. An older inmate named Bembry took Malcolm under his wing and convinced him that if he got educated, he might get his sentence reduced. Malcolm started taking mailing courses, reading books, and memorizing dictionary words. Around this time, Malcolm began a correspondence with the leader of a tiny new religious group, the Nation of Islam. The group preached that thousands of years ago, everyone in the world had dark skin. Then, a disturbed man named Jacob created white people as devils. The more Malcolm thought about his interactions with white people so far in his young life, the more he realized that almost everyone he had met had treated him badly. He had an epiphany. They were devils. When Malcolm got paroled in 1952, he moved to Detroit to become a minister. With his rebirth, he got rid of his surname Little. He now called himself Malcolm X. X developed impressive speaking skills. He preached that the Black man deserves self-respect. This message resonated with poor African-American males especially. Soon, he was giving speeches to crowds of 4,000 at a time. X pushed for the opposite of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s integration movement. He negotiated alliances with the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party to promote the thing all 3 groups wanted, to keep blacks and whites far apart from each other. Unlike King, X did not believe that white people could ever stop hating black people. And then, something impossible happened. All right, so we're going to see what that impossible thing that happened was in the second part. But let's jump into learning some of the different expressions, some of the different advanced expressions that we had in this story. So we have this term white supremacist. So this word supremacist is formed from the word supreme. And if something is supreme, it's like the best of something. So someone who is a white supremacist or black supremacist believes that their race is the best. And then we have this group, the Ku Klux Klan. So it's a bit of a cultural note for you guys. This was a group, I believe actually it still exists even, but it's much less popular than it was in Malcolm X's time. But it was a group that really like promoted, oftentimes through violent ways, the separation of black people or other minorities and white people. They believe that white people were the superior race, and they really are kind of a bizarre group too. Like they had this bizarre way of dressing. So it really was kind of like a cult. Okay, so we heard that the police ruled Malcolm's father's death an accident. So rule used in this sense, which is usually like in a legal setting. For example, judges make a ruling on a certain case. Basically, it just means to make a judgment or to make a decision. So even though it wasn't at all true, even though everyone else knew that it wasn't the truth, they said that it was an accident, the way that Malcolm's father died by getting run over by a car. And things don't go so well for Malcolm's mother either, right? She has to take care of him and his 7 siblings, and she cracks. So when we use crack in this sense, it basically means that someone goes crazy. Like she actually had to be put into a mental institution to be taken care of. Okay, so Malcolm actually had some really nice aspirations when he was young. He wanted to become a lawyer, but his teachers basically went against that. They told him that he was crazy, and just because they were racist, right? They didn't think a black person could be a lawyer. So it talks about this, that racism stood in Malcolm's way. If something stands in your way, it's basically a barrier for you. For example, like how you might believe that not living in an English-speaking country stands in your way from becoming fluent. But of course, if you've been following us for a while, you know that that is not at all true, that I've met many, many learners from all around the world who have been able to get to even native levels of fluency without ever living in an English-speaking country, just by finding great opportunities to really immerse themselves in the language, even just living in a country where the language isn't spoken. And we have this word, I spelled it. I didn't say it because it's like the worst word that you can say in English. It's N-I-G-G-E-R. And it's a very, very racist, very derogatory term used against African Americans, used against black people. So not a word that you should use yourself, but it's a word you might hear in certain media. We saw that Malcolm wanted to become a lawyer, but his teacher told him, why don't you plan on carpentry instead? So a carpentry, the person would be called a carpenter, is someone who builds and fixes different furniture. For example, you might have heard that Jesus Christ was supposedly a carpenter. And Malcolm felt like really discouraged by his teachers not supporting his dream. So he decided, like, what's the point of school? And he dropped out. You might have heard, for example, some famous CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg, that they dropped out of university to work full-time on their business. So yeah, basically it just means to leave, to willingly leave school. Malcolm got sent to prison basically because he tried to fence a watch. I think this might not be the most common term nowadays, but it basically means to sell something illegally. So basically he probably stole the watch from someone and then got caught trying to sell it. And his bad luck certainly didn't stop there. So he was dating a white girl, and we see that she sold him out from the witness box. The witness box is like in a courtroom. You can think about, there's the place where the judge sits, and usually next to it, there's a seat that's kind of like behind a box where witness, someone who has observed a crime, where they sit while the different lawyers are asking them questions. So his girlfriend was one witness of him fencing or illegally selling this watch, and she sold him out, meaning that he trusted her, but she, basically told the truth anyway and got him in trouble. You could also use like to narc on someone or to rat someone out. These are other nice expressions that mean the same thing. Okay, and as we saw earlier, judges make a ruling. Another way we can say this is that judges sentence someone, and they gave Malcolm the maximum sentence. So basically for any crime in the United States, there tends to be, I think it depends on the state as well, there tends to be a range of months or years that someone can go to prison. Or it can also just be like a fine that you have to pay, or community service or something like this. So you can be sentenced to pay a fine, can be sentenced to do community service. Or in this case, he got the maximum sentence, meaning that in the range of how many years he could go to prison for this crime, the judge gave him the maximum, again, being racist because he was dating a white girl. And there was a really nice term here. So he had 6 to 8 years to let that hate fester from inside a federal prison. So fester basically means to let something bad or negative become worse over time. This literally is used for like if you have a wound and you didn't take care of that wound and it became infected, you could say that you let that wound fester. But it's used here in a more of a figurative sense, like we can use it for emotions like it was here, or we can use it also for problems. For example, you can let a secret fester, that it's like it's weighing on your conscience because that, you're not being able to tell that secret that you think you should tell. Or you can let hate fester. So you're letting that bad emotion really like grow and grow, which is what happened to Malcolm in prison. All right. But then in prison, Malcolm met this older inmate named 𝗵𝗡𝗄. We see that he took Malcolm under his wing. This is another really nice expression. It means that you look out for someone, you take care of someone. Oftentimes it has a sense of mentoring the person, like teaching them what you know. So that's basically what he did. He said like, you should really get an education because you might get let out earlier due to good behavior. And one of the things that happened to Malcolm while he was in prison is that he started a correspondence with someone who was a leader of the Nation of Islam. So basically, we didn't see this so much in the story, but Malcolm became a really important figure in this Nation of Islam. In fact, I forget the name of the leader of the group. Maybe she can look it up and write it to me here. But he reached a much, much bigger audience than the leader was ever able to. Okay, so she just told me that the name of that leader was Elijah Muhammad. So Malcolm started corresponding with Elijah. This basically means sending mail back and forth, sending letters back and forth. Or nowadays, you could also correspond via email. But of course, the traditional with letters isn't as common nowadays. And the group preached that thousands of years ago, everyone was dark-skinned, but then there was this disturbed man named 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗟 who created white people as devils. So a bit of a crazy, outlandish, we could say, theory. But if you preach something, basically it means that you're spreading the word about something. That we have, for example, we actually use the word preacher for people who are religious figures who talk in front of an audience. So it comes from the same root, right? There's a really nice expression actually too. We say you're preaching to the choir. So when someone is telling you something, telling you an opinion of theirs that you already agree with, you can say you're preaching to the choir. Like I already agree with you 100%. You don't need to, try to pound this into me. And this person that they use in their story, 𝗥𝗲𝗹, that he was disturbed, that basically just means that he was crazy. And when Malcolm is actually like reflecting on his own experience with white people, this theory that like white people are the devil, it made sense to him. He had an epiphany because that had been his experience all his life. An epiphany, or we also call this an aha moment. This is basically a sudden realization. All of a sudden you kind of put two and two together. This is another way we can say it. You put things together and you understand them. And you're like, oh, of course, Eureka. And he got paroled. So as we saw, like 𝗵𝗡𝗄 gave him this advice to study, learn things, maybe be let out early on good behavior. Another word we can say this is to be paroled. So usually it's that you're released from prison earlier than your sentence, but usually it has some conditions. Like if you don't meet those conditions, you'll go back to prison. So if one condition might be, for example, that within a certain amount of time, you actually need to get a job so that, just to make sure that if you were caught selling drugs, that you don't go back to selling drugs again. And we talked about this earlier about how Malcolm became really popular amongst African Americans because he talked about how Black people needed and deserved self-respect, that they need to learn to love themselves. This is what we saw in the speech at the beginning, right? And he says that this message resonated a lot with African Americans, especially African American men. If something resonates with you, it speaks to you. It aligns with your personal values. So, for example, you might find that our way of teaching English really resonates with you. That might be why you're here, right? All right, so far we've seen the first part of Malcolm's story, his young life, all his different difficulties that largely were caused by racism, even from a very young age, his disillusionment with, like the educational system, with the legal system, going to prison, becoming someone who is quite radically fighting for segregation of Black and white people for Black and white people being separated, but actually coming from an angle of supporting Black rights and Black people having self-respect, right? So let's see, what was the something impossible that happened at the end of that first part? X went off the grid for a little while. When he came back, he began talking very differently. A man should not be judged by the color of his skin, Malcolm X declared in an interview, but rather by his conscious behavior, by his actions. His followers were dismayed. Was this a joke? No. X clarified himself. I believe in taking an uncompromising stand against any forms of segregation and discrimination. Had the separatists just taken up the integration torch of the civil rights movement? People on both sides were shocked. He was gone. X renounced the label Black nationalist. He abandoned the Nation of Islam and became a Sunni Muslim. He declared that it would take Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, agnostics, and even atheists to make the human family. In interviews, X expressed remorse for many of his past views and actions. Remember the time that white girl came into the restaurant? The one who wanted to help the Muslims and the whites get together? And I told her there wasn't a ghost of a chance, and she went away crying? He said to a local reporter, I've lived to regret that incident. I'm sorry. Malcolm X's transformation was so complete and so upsetting to the NOI leadership that many people were not surprised to hear the news when, on the afternoon of February 21st, 1965, a man stood up in the front row of the Audubon Theater in Harlem during X's speech and pulled a shotgun out from under his coat. All right, guys, I'm really excited for you to see the rest of the lesson. We're going to break down all of those advanced expressions that we just saw highlighted in the second part of the story, as well as the test, which is super important because it's your moment to really see the fruits of your labor. That means that you are able to feel how your hard work is paid off because you're able to understand so much more than the first time around by putting all that effort into like learning the new expressions and so on. And so that you never forget those expressions and you're able to actually use them when you get in conversation and really blow that person that you're talking to away by using some really fluent expressions. Then you can use the vocabulary flashcards on the RealLife English app to never forget them, all right? So get the rest of today's lesson, the vocabulary flashcards, and so much more by tapping the link in the description below from your phone, and it's absolutely free, so you really have nothing to lose. All right, look forward to seeing you over there. Aw, yeah.